26,000 men, forced to march 65 miles through the Philippine jungle, in April heat, without food, without water, without medical care. They were prisoners of war, American and Filipino soldiers who had surrendered to Japanese forces after the fall of Bataan on April 9, 1942. They had been promised humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. What they got was a death march. Approximately 10,000 men died on that road. Shot for falling behind. Bayonet for stopping to drink from a ditch. Beheaded for no reason that any survivor could identify. Left in the sun until they stopped moving. The march was witnessed by American soldiers who survived it. It was reported. It was documented. It was the subject of one of the earliest war crimes trials of the Pacific War. The Japanese general held responsible was executed in 1946. 80 years later, Japan has never issued a formal apology for the Bataan Death March. The Philippines is still waiting. The Bataan Death March did not begin with cruelty. It began with a surrender. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King Jr. made the most difficult decision of his military career. The American and Filipino forces under his command on the Bataan Peninsula, approximately 76,000 men, starving, diseased, and exhausted after 4 months of fighting a Japanese advance that had begun the day after Pearl Harbor, had reached the end of what they could endure. They had no food. They had no ammunition. They had no prospect of reinforcement. General Douglas MacArthur had been evacuated to Australia by direct order of President Roosevelt weeks earlier. The men he left behind had fought as long as they could fight. King surrendered. It was the largest American military surrender since the Civil War, larger than Corregidor, larger than any other single capitulation in American military history to that point. 76,000 men laid down their arms and became prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army. Under the Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but subsequently declined to fully ratify, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment. They could not be subjected to violence. They had to be provided with adequate food, water, and medical care. Their status as non-combatants was protected by international law. The Japanese military's response to the 76,000 prisoners on Bataan was to march them to a prison camp at Camp O'Donnell, approximately 65 miles to the north. The decision to march rather than transport, in a region where the Japanese military had access to vehicles, was made by the command structure of the Japanese 14th Army. The logistics of processing 76,000 prisoners had not been planned for. The scale of the surrender had exceeded Japanese expectations. What happened on that road was the consequence of decisions made at the command level about how to handle a logistics problem. The men who died on the march were not casualties of battle. They were casualties of those decisions. The 76,000 men who surrendered at Bataan were not a uniform group. Approximately 12,000 were American, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had been stationed in the Philippines when Japan attacked in December 1941. The remainder were Filipino soldiers of the Philippine Army and Philippine Scouts, fighting alongside their American allies in the defense of their own country. They had been fighting since December. By April, the conditions on Bataan had been deteriorating for months, rations had been cut to half and then to quarter as supply lines failed, disease had spread through the crowded defensive positions, and the specific misery of a siege conducted in tropical heat had ground down the physical and psychological resources of men who had received almost no support from the outside world. When they surrendered, many were already on the edge of what the human body can endure. The march began the next day. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The march began on April 10, 1942, and lasted approximately 12 days. What occurred on that road has been documented through the testimony of survivors, Americans and Filipinos who completed the march and lived to describe what they had witnessed and experienced. The testimonies were collected by American military investigators, by war crimes tribunals, and by journalists and historians across the 8 decades since. They are consistent in their general description and harrowing in their specific detail. The prisoners were given no food for the first 2 days. Water was provided irregularly, sometimes not at all for stretches that lasted a full day in temperatures that reached above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners who broke ranks to drink from ditches or puddles by the roadside were beaten. Some were shot. The specific prohibition on drinking, enforced by guards who themselves had water, was not a logistical failure. It was a choice. Prisoners who fell behind were killed. The methods varied. Some were bayonet where they fell. Some were beaten to death. Some were shot. Some were beheaded, guards competing, by survivor accounts, in demonstrations of swordsmanship on men who were too exhausted to stand. Some were simply left in the sun until they stopped being a logistics problem. The pace was maintained regardless of the physical state of the men being marched. Those who could not keep up did not receive assistance. They received the consequences of falling behind. Filipino civilians along the route attempted to pass food and water to the prisoners. Some succeeded. Guards who observed them doing so beat the civilians and sometimes the prisoners they had tried to help. The specific acts of violence on the march were not uniform. Some guards were observed treating prisoners with relative restraint. Others were observed committing acts of gratuitous cruelty that survivors described with the specific recall of people who had watched and were unable to intervene. The death toll of the march itself has never been precisely established. American deaths on the march, estimated between 600 and 650. Filipino deaths, estimated between 5,000 and 10,000. The disparity reflects both the larger number of Filipino prisoners and the specific additional vulnerability of Filipino soldiers, who were treated by some Japanese guards with a specific contempt that went beyond the already inadequate treatment of American prisoners. The total death toll from the march and the subsequent conditions at Camp O'Donnell, where prisoners arrived to find inadequate food, water, and medical facilities, extended the casualties significantly beyond what the march itself produced. An estimated 1,600 Americans and between 16,000 and 26,000 Filipinos died at Camp O'Donnell in the months that followed. The question that historians have examined in the decades since the march is the one that makes it more than a logistics failure. Why did the guards do what they did? The structural answer, the absence of adequate food and water logistics, the command decisions about pace and handling of stragglers, accounts for some of what happened. It does not account for the specific acts of cruelty that survivor testimony documents. The men who were bayoneted for falling behind did not die because of a logistics failure. They died because a person with a weapon decided to kill them. The research into Japanese military culture of the period, the specific training and ideological conditioning of soldiers who entered the war with a framework that dehumanized prisoners of war, that understood surrender as the ultimate disgrace and therefore those who surrendered as having forfeited their human status, provides a partial answer. It is a partial answer because partial answers are the honest ones. Men made choices on that road. The choices killed people. The system that produced those choices, the military culture, the command decisions, the specific absence of accountability, created the conditions. The men who made the choices made them anyway. The Bataan Death March was the subject of one of the earliest and most significant war crimes trials of the Pacific War. General Masaharu Homma, commander of the Japanese 14th Army whose forces had conducted the march, was tried by an American military tribunal in Manila in 1946. The proceedings were controversial. Critics noted that the tribunal had significant procedural irregularities, that the standard of command responsibility being applied was not consistently defined, and that the speed of the proceedings did not allow adequate preparation of the defense. Homma was convicted. He was executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946. His execution was, by the assessment of the military tribunal, justice for what had occurred on the road from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. By the assessment of many of the survivors who had walked that road, it was insufficient, a single death against the deaths of thousands, conducted at a remove from the specific acts of cruelty that those thousands had witnessed. The legal principle applied in Homma's trial, that a commander bears responsibility for the actions of forces under his command, was the same Yamashita standard that this channel covered in the Manila Massacre episode. The principle has become a cornerstone of international military law. Its application to Homma was one of its earliest uses. The Japanese government's position on the Bataan Death March has evolved across 8 decades without reaching the point of formal apology. Official acknowledgments of what occurred have been made. Japanese prime ministers have expressed condolences for the suffering of prisoners of war during the Pacific War in language that stops short of specific acknowledgement of the Death March as a war crime for which the Japanese state bears responsibility. The specific phrase that survivors and their advocates have consistently said they need, a formal apology, by name, for what was done on that road, has not been delivered. The last American survivors of the Bataan Death March have died. The final known survivor, Celestino Almeida, a Filipino veteran, died in 2022 at the age of 102. He had walked that road in 1942. He had waited 80 years for an apology. He did not receive one. The road from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell is still there. It is a highway now, paved, traveled daily by the ordinary traffic of a Philippine province that has grown up around and over the geography of what happened in April 1942. The specific stretches of dirt road that 76,000 men were forced to walk are buried under asphalt. The jungle that pressed in on either side has been cleared and cultivated and built upon. The Philippines has memorialized the march. The Bataan Death March Memorial in the Philippines marks the route. Annual memorial marches, conducted by veterans groups, by military units, by ordinary citizens who choose to walk a portion of the route in remembrance, have been held for decades. The specific acts of remembrance that a community performs for its own dead are present and sustained. What is absent is the formal acknowledgement from the government that ordered what happened. Japan has expressed regret for the suffering of World War II in general language that encompasses the Death March without naming it. Japan has provided economic assistance to the Philippines in amounts that have been described, as with Korea, as cooperation rather than reparation. Japan has maintained diplomatic relationships with the Philippines that are, by any measure, functional and sometimes warm. None of this is the same as an apology. The survivors who might have heard it are almost all gone. Celestino Almeida walked 65 miles in April 1942. He lived to 102. He gave interviews about what he had seen on that road until the end of his life. He was asked, in one of his final interviews, what he wanted. He said, an apology. Just the words. Just someone in authority saying what was done was wrong. He died in 2022. The words had not come.